Our next guest on the stage here with me is Professor Simon Shibli, and I'm probably going to let Simon maybe do a quick introduction to himself. And I suppose, Simon, tell us a bit about who you are, your work, and your connection to the GAA. Would that be maybe a good way to open up?
Yeah, thanks, Dave, and good morning, everybody. Unlike Jarlath Burns, who is a man who needs no introduction, I'm not even a household name in my own house. So I really welcome the opportunity of being able to introduce myself to you and to set up how we did the research and what it means. So I'm Simon Shibli, although I'm not really Simon Shibli. Simon is what I'm known as. My father was from Pakistan, and in his wisdom christened his eldest son Salim Ahmed Shibli, which is what's in my passport. Anyway, my mother was Catholic, sent me to Catholic school, taught by nuns, and the nuns said, "We can't possibly have a boy here called Salim. We'll have to find an English equivalent." And that is where Simon came from. So that's what I am known as. And being at a Catholic boarding school in England, I was jealous not to be Irish, because St. Patrick's Day, all the Irish kids got to wear shamrock and got treated nicely, and their parents sent them tuck and all the rest of it. And I was always envious. So the opportunity to work on the island of Ireland has been absolutely fantastic. A long time ago, I met my good friend Paul Donnelly from Ulster University, Antrim GAA man, and he's taken me to his club, St. Paul's. He brought me here to Croke Park in 2015, where we saw Kilkenny beat Galway, I think. Let me see if I've done my homework. 122 versus 118. Is that right? And this place, it felt almost like a cathedral of sport. And I've said to Peter Horgan and Cian Murphy, who commissioned this research, it was an experience for me that transcended sport. We drove down from Belfast. We walked around the town. Everywhere we knew, the people I was with seemed to know other people. When we came to the stadium, there was this kind of fervour. The match, even though I'm not familiar with hurling particularly, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It's probably the only place I've got hair. And so I have done similar research for Wimbledon, the London Marathon, the Henley Royal Regatta. I've worked for the Royal and Ancient since 2010 on every single Open Golf Championship. And you kind of develop this bucket list of all the things that you've done. What would you like to do? And the top of that list was, can we do an economic and social impact of Gaelic games? And while we're at it, can we have a look at the economic importance of major sport events, which is probably where I started my career in this field.
So this particular research and the idea for this research, where did that come from? Where did it originate from? And when you were brought into the room, what was said to you, and how did you interpret that?
Well, I think there were three key influences. First of all, as Jarlath was saying, there was some kind of momentum within the GAA to do this. On the one hand, you had the communications manager, Cian Murphy, who was also a fantastic historian of Gaelic games, saying, look, everybody else is doing this, we need to do this. If we have this kind of information, it helps in how we communicate and how we liaise with Sport Ireland, with government, local authorities, and so on. So there was a certain amount of push within the GAA anyway. As I've said, the second influence was my own personal bucket list. You know, I can die a happy man now. I've done many of the sporting events that I would like to, but the one thing we didn't have on the roster of clients was something significant for the GAA. And then a kind of glue that made it happen was my good friend Paul Donnelly, that he is a GAA man. He's a club man, he's an Antrim county man, he's played county hurling in his day. He worked for Sport Northern Ireland and then spent a few years working for the GAA on the Gaelfast project. And all the time we're having this conversation, wouldn't it be fantastic to do this? And eventually, with the pushing of Cian and Peter, myself and Paul, finally the GAA buckled and they decided that they would commission this piece of work. But there was no guarantee it was going to come to us. We had to put in a tender, and there are some very good consultants and practices on the island of Ireland who put in more than credible bids. I think there were some that even were cheaper than we were. But for whatever reason, Larry and the team at the time, and they gave us a really hard grilling when we came over here, were brave enough to give it to these idiots from England, supported by Paul in Ulster, who gave us that sort of link to the GAA and a certain amount of Gaelic Games credibility. That was, I think we commissioned, we had the interview in August, we commissioned in October, and then a really, really intense but thoroughly enjoyable 13 months getting my head around all of this.
That brings us, as you said, at the end of the 13 months, obviously there's significant output from that. It's drawn a lot of media attention. Can you maybe give us a brief overview of the findings? I know you're doing a workshop later on as well, and you've presented these before, but for the benefit of this audience in person, the brief overview of the findings.
Yeah, numbers on their own they just go over your head. So let me give you a few numbers and just put things into context. So the first up was what we call consumer spending. How much do people spend on Gaelic games? And it was about 377 million euro. And in round numbers, that works out at something like 50 euro per head of population across the entirety of the island. But probably a more interesting figure is that if you take the entirety of Gaelic games, including the Ladies Gaelic Football Association, the Camogie Association, you take people who are non-playing members of clubs, there's roughly 700,000. And there is roughly 7 million people on the island. So 1 in 10 are members of a GAA club, and they're spending 377 million euros. So in people who are engaged in Gaelic games, it works out at roughly 500 euro per year per person who is engaged in this series of sports. Probably the most important contribution is what we call gross value added. You've probably all heard of gross domestic product, the size of the economy. Well, gross value added is an approximation of that. It's probably about 95% of GDP. They're that close. And two things struck me about that. The first is GVA is made up of wages and profits. And this is a volunteer sport. So clearly there's not much in the way of wages. But because it is a volunteer sport, the GAA, the provinces, the counties, the clubs, more often than not, clock up quite a significant surplus, which for the most part, they reinvest, whether it be doing up clubs, floodlights, walking tracks, gyms, creches, drainage, mowers, whatever. The money that otherwise might go on wages is reinvested. And so you have this massive gross value added. And it is about 9% of the gross value added of the entire sport industry. And if you think the industry includes everything to do with physical activity, like walking, and it includes the equine industry and racing, and it includes gambling, to be 9% of that really is quite something. And if you go a step further and say, let's not look at it in the context of the sport industry, let's look at it in the context of the whole economy, you still have a figure of something like it's 0.13, so just over 1/10 of 1%. But the fact that this series of sports that we're all involved in is measurable at the level of the national economy of Ireland really is quite something. And it supports 10,600 jobs. One thing that really struck me about the GAA itself was I looked at the accounts for 2022, and the turnover of the GAA was 138 million. And I thought, how many people generate this? So I looked in the accounts, and it had the payroll, number of staff. There's 154 staff. So you've probably worked out by now, I'm actually a bit of a nerd, particularly with numbers and things. And that works out at 954,000 euros per employee. And think about where you work in your own businesses and your own jobs. How many businesses have a revenue of nearly €1 million per employee? I'm thinking maybe Goldman Sachs, the higher levels of Meta, Facebook, Amazon. But in most businesses, to justify one job, you probably need turnover revenue of about 100,000. And here we have something which is doing nearly 10 times that. And let's not be foolish about this. It's not 154 people generating 138 million. It's all of the volunteers who contribute to that and who make it happen.
That whole social aspect, I might come on to in a second. But in terms of the report, was there any surprises for you from an economic perspective?
Yeah, from an economic perspective, that it was such a high percentage of the sport industry, that it was measurable in the context of the economy. So in economic terms, what you have is a big entity. But if I can move on to the social value side of things, then we have this figure of 2.87 billion in social value. And there are 4 components of that. The most modest one, which is health, is something like 31 million. The next one, what we call subjective well-being. People who play Gaelic games have higher life satisfaction than the general population. And so the income we would have to compensate people for if we took Gaelic games out of their lives would be 556 million. And that's like the second smallest. The 2 big ones. First is social capital amongst volunteers, predominantly, but also players, in the sense of the enhanced trust, sense of community and reciprocity that you have is 1.2 billion. And I can tell you in my career, I've done this many times and for many organizations, and we've always been cautious of using the B word, billion, because it is just such an enormous number to conceptualize. So we've got 1.2 billion in social capital. And then one thing you can take back to the counties and the clubs is that the value of volunteering, the replacement cost of the time that people give willingly, is just over $1 billion. So the surprising thing for me then is that the totality of that is just over 2.8 billion. We'll call it 2.8, and we'll call the GVA, the gross value added, 700 million. And very conveniently, 700 million goes into 2.8 billion precisely 4 times. So what we're saying here is that although the economic value is very significant, the social value is actually 4 times that figure.
The report itself got a lot of attention. Have you been surprised by how people have communicated and indeed interpreted the data?
I've been pleasantly surprised in some respects because I watched the Late Late Show last night and saw the hard time that Paddy Keelty gave to Jarlath. And over the 30 months of this research and over my time working with Paul and seeing how things are in Ulster, I have this sense that people are sceptical towards the GAA. And when something like this report came out, which really 2.8 billion social value is a massive figure, I thought that the reaction would be that people would try and knock it. And yet nothing could have been further from the truth. We had a launch in one of the hospitality boxes on the 6th floor. It was, I think, the day before the election. And we did a piece to TV for RTE, but what's the guy's name? Marty came and interviewed me.
Marty Morrissey.
But for whatever reason, it didn't make the 6 o'clock news. But the amount of coverage it got in the newspapers and online was quite unlike anything I have ever seen. And, you know, as I said at the beginning, I'm not really used to this. I like being anonymous. I sort of do my work and then I crawl back under the stone from whence I came and the world carries on. But all of a sudden, I stayed here for 4 days and found myself in the center of what for me felt like a media maelstrom. And although we didn't get on TV with RTE, we did get on the radio. And it didn't get off to a great start. I was in one of the boxes on the 6th floor. The reception wasn't brilliant. And we started the interview. Oh, we'll come back to you. So we cut it off. They called me back. We got a decent line. And eventually I did it. And within 5 minutes, I was back in the office on the laptop. And an email came through from a Mary Coffey of Drogheda. And she was a friend of my late mother's and said, Simon, I heard you on the radio. I never knew you were into Gaelic games. And it's that kind of small thing that just takes me completely by surprise, given my own penchant for, being pretty anonymous.
You also ended up on Joe Brolly. So Jared had his Paddy Keelty moment. You had your Joe Brolly moment.
The Joe Brolly moment was brilliant. I'd never heard of Joe Brolly or...
You don't say that now, you'll only antagonise him. I've never heard of him.
or indeed the Free State podcast. But where I work at Sheffield Hallam University, we have a dean of college, so someone of Dave's level. Dave's up here, I'm kind of down here somewhere in the university world. But this guy is called Connor Moss, and he's an Ulster man and a very good Gaelic footballer in his time. Not, county, but I think certainly club level. And, he's somebody in the university who might be my boss's boss's boss. And I'm minding my own business at work, and this message comes through on Teams. I've just heard you on Joe Brolly's Free State podcast. It was all about your research. Just in case you don't know, Joe Brolly and the Free State podcast are massive. Okay, Connor, I'll have a listen to this. And I thought we came out of it pretty well. The story that he had picked up on was, and this is where I really confirm my nerd credentials, is as part of this, I had analysed the accounts of 513 clubs. Most of them I'd done myself, just collating the income and various other things. And I'd been going through the accounts, and I'd been seeing things like £20 for mass cards, 20 euros, 80 euros for a wreath. There were wedding presents. And then I was reading Broadford GAA's accounts, and I see this line, funeral expenses, €3,600. I just thought, what the hell is this? I've got to find out more. So it turns out that a young player, he was a University of Limerick student, had been on holiday. He'd been involved in an incident involving, I think, an altercation followed by being hit by a car. Anyway, he was killed in this incident. And he and I think two of his brothers were playing for the club. His father had played for the club. His uncle had played for the club. And so they put their hands in their pockets and they paid €3,600 towards the funeral. And just that one incident told me that we're dealing with something different here. This is not your average sport. This is not a rugby club in England or a golf club in Scotland. Here we are dealing with something which is much more embedded in its community, something that reflects the way of life, the connectedness, the social capital that people have. And a lot of what we do or what we have done, you could describe as the chemistry set. But that one story was like the litmus test that told me, here we are dealing with something really unique.
I'm conscious of time, but I have a couple of questions I do want to put. You're talking to an audience of county officers. Okay, and I know you're doing a workshop later on, and I would encourage you guys if you can make it. I'm promoting all the workshops equally here, but Simon's doing a workshop on the economic and social value of Gaelic games in the island of Ireland, which will probably be very much about how we use this data. But for the county officers here, in summary, how do we use this? How do we use the information that you've brought to us?
Well, this is where I get hard-nosed about it. The GAA has invested a significant sum of money in this research. And I need to be able to look myself in the mirror, and I need to be able to sleep at night. And the way I can do that is if the research is seen as an investment rather than an expense. Now, I'll give you an example. In 2017, I did something similar for what was then the Confederation for Golf in Ireland. I think it's now, is it Ireland Golf? Or Golf Ireland, something like that. Anyway, I wouldn't say that our research caused this to happen, but it was a contributory factor. Before we did the research, Golf Ireland received 300,000 euro from Sport Ireland from the Capital Projects Fund. After the research was published and Sport Ireland got their head around the economics of golf, it went up sixfold to 1.8 million euro. And ideally, I want something like this to happen with our fee so that it is an investment. And I think, well, we already know, Sport Ireland are interested and impressed with the work. In next month, early next month, we have a meeting with members of the Northern Ireland Assembly. There's an all-party group for sport who are interested in this. We hopefully, so I've adopted Stockholm Syndrome and become sympathetic to my captors and start saying we, but you have a new Minister for Sport who will be appointed. So what is it? Tourism, culture, arts, Gaeltact, sport and media. And the thing about Gaelic Games is it cuts across all of those agendas. So rather than taking this narrow look at sport, we need to be looking at the cultural aspects as well and making GAA relevant to the entirety of that minister's portfolio and levering the funding that we can to recognize what you do, but also one of the things that's really motivated me has been the notion of integration in 2027, that as you come together with the Ladies Gaelic Football Association and Camogie Association, significant investment will be needed to make that happen as seamlessly and effectively as possible. And I hope that the research provides the levers to make that happen.
You've spoken a lot about the highlights from the work and the outcome and so on, and even indeed the communication since the interviews. You've spoken about the people you worked with. You've spoken about coming over to do the pitch and the subsequent work. What was the biggest highlight for you personally?
I would think across the 13 months, the friendliness with which we have been accepted, the professionalism, the interest, that sense of feeling welcome, just sitting next to random people last night and having a conversation about which county are you from, did you used to be a player, listening to the brilliant work which is being done by the demographics officer. I can tell you in all the stuff that I do, I have never seen a situation whereby a county board for any sport would have a demographics officer. And so we have some people focusing on the day-to-day of how well is our team going to do, but some people who are thinking 5-10 years ahead, this is what's happening in the population and these are the implications for our sport 5-10 years hence, a generation hence. So all of that.
Thanks very much, Simon. Simon, just on behalf of everybody here, and I'll just say thank you very much for being with us this morning. Just to probably say, Simon isn't a huge globetrotter, but he is actually going to Qatar tomorrow morning. So I don't know if anybody can compete with that in the room, but just say thank you very much for coming over to be with us and for joining us today and for the work that you have done. And hopefully it will have the impact that you foresee. So thank you again.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.